What would you say are the critical ingredients for innovation at a national level?
You need some kind of a national leadership that supports innovation.
Politicians will tell you that, oh, we're so pro-innovation. However, the execution versus the lip service differs.
You need that kind of cross-ministry collaboration to be able to actually get innovation to be executed successfully in a country. The reality is that that does not always happen.
What advice would you give emerging market leaders if they want to jumpstart innovation in their country?
Provide the best possible education, attract some talent from outside, really try to make life simple for entrepreneurs. Countries that are less sophisticated from a STEM perspective should focus more on the market-driven innovation. Create innovations for the local markets using existing technologies.
Hi, my name is Wahid Nabil and welcome to the Emerging Market Innovation series of the Innovation Civilization podcast. In these very special series of focused episodes, we talk with innovation experts, leaders, practitioners, policymakers, and investors on everything related to doing innovation in the emerging markets part of the world and really synthesizing the lessons learned. Today, my guest is Dr. Soumitra Dutta, who is the Dean and Professor of Management at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford in the UK. He is also the founder and co-editor of the Global Innovation Index, which is the standardized innovation rankings of all the countries of the world. Professor Dutta also co-founded companies before like Fisheye Analytics, and he was also a venture capitalist before as the founding advisor of the Green Frontier Capital, a VC firm focused on early stage climate tech ventures. Before joining Oxford in 2022, he's also the founding dean of the Cornell Johnson College of Business at INSEAD. I'm also joined today by my friend and co-host in the panel today, Hafidzi Razali, who is an emerging markets public policy and strategic communications advisor and CEO of the firm Strategic Counsel. So sit tight and enjoy the show. All right, Dr. Soumitra, welcome to the Innovation Civilization podcast. What a great pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Pleasure is also mine.
Brilliant. So Doctor, you've basically been so much involved in innovation, like you've started companies, you've been a VC yourself, venture capitalist. You've spent a bunch of time in academia with one of the best institutions in the world, and you're leading one of them now. So I want to ask you basically about when you say innovation, and you're the author of the Innovation Index as well. How do you sort of define innovation? Is it something more like invention, like creating something new, or is it something broader, basically? I just want to peg the goalpost a little bit for the audience,
No, it's a very important question to begin with because a lot of people use different words to refer to the same phenomena, similar phenomena, creativity, invention, innovation. And I think the way I like to think of innovation more precisely is that it's really something that is new in some form, that is brought to the market successfully. So what it means out here really is there's a notion of a market. So there are customers and people who actually generate or create or get some value from something that is being offered to them. And that's something that is being offered to them ideally should be somehow new and different from what they had before. So that's really for me the two key components, in terms of new and different from before, either product or process or in the business model. And is there a customer or customer group that is actually accessing it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this applies to, I guess, public service innovations as well. If I'm a government and I'm creating a new product or service for the citizens, that would consider innovation as well, even though it's in a market which is not privatized, let's say.
Yeah, so I think, governments are a very important source of innovations in most countries. And the government is also both an enabler of innovation and also at the same time a customer of innovation. So it's important to keep in mind that government can play two roles. So the public sector, of course, does many things that it does for its citizenry. And the way it does things can be innovative, can be different, can be new. The citizens actually appreciate. They may not actually pay a direct monetary value for it in some cases they may. But in most cases, the government does its duty of providing services, and that is part of the innovation that is inherent in the government domain. But at the same time, we also know governments can support innovation by, for example, its procurement processes. Governments have to obtain certain products and services from the market, and many governments, in fact, today, both in many markets today, prescribe that a certain proportion of the products and services it purchases actually comes from innovative young companies. And by directing some of the expenditure towards young companies or innovative young companies, the government can actually be a very big stimulant of the role of a catalyzer of innovation and economy.
Yeah, that's really interesting, really. And I think you've talked about this in your kind of papers as well. There's like different set of institutions, right, that help with innovation. There's obviously, the universities and the research. There's obviously private markets. There's obviously the venture capital and private equity and public markets. And governments is, I guess, one of the enablers setting that kind of standard, right? The base infrastructure, let's say, for this sort of innovation to build up on in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I look at the innovation chain in some respects, I often compare it to a linked chain. You have various links in a chain connected with each other, and you identify some of the possible links out there. You have the people, which essentially means, all the investments a society makes in schools and universities and other kinds of R&D training. You have the link of the whole regulatory context in which companies actually have to be born and which they exist. You have the link of the private markets and the public markets, where you essentially get capital financing, either from a VC or from the public markets or debt financing. And then you, of course, have the important aspect of actual, supply chain and reaching the customer. So all these links are very important. And if one link is weak or is broken, fundamentally the whole innovation system doesn't work very well. So you might have, for example, great human capital in a certain part of the world, but if the universities are not good, guess what? The innovation system will not work very well. You might have, great companies in some part of the world, but if the infrastructure is not good and it actually is very difficult or very expensive for you to ship goods from one part of the world, one part of the country to another, again, innovation will not work as well. So it's very important that a good innovation system actually has all the links strong and they're connected to each other, and that's very important.
Yeah, that makes sense, really. And what would you say are like the critical ingredients for innovation, at a national level, basically, right? If we're to think about this.
Yeah, so, we have looked as part of my global innovation index research, looked at innovation strategies, innovation successes, and not so great successes in many, many countries over the years. And what we find is, at the overarching level, you need some kind of a national leadership that supports innovation. If, for example, the leadership of the country doesn't actually understand the benefit of innovation, doesn't see how fast-moving it is, doesn't see how it creates value for the country, then innovation may not happen as much as it could potentially in the country. Just to give an example, digital technologies today are widely regarded as being very important for driving innovation in various ways, and the leadership of the country does not actually believe in enabling or sustaining, leadership practices in technology, then you may not actually have a lot of digital innovation taking part in the country. So leadership and national innovation strategy is very, very important. But then there are various building blocks or the links in the chain which are all very important, and they're essentially around the regulatory and the business context. How are the rules and regulations in the country? Are they stable? Are they business friendly? How difficult is it to, for example, close a business? Closing a business is a very important indicator because, not all business succeed. A large portion of them actually fail. And the way in which countries and the regulation actually treat business failures is a very important aspect of regulatory ease of doing business. You have the whole issue of human capital, which is very critical. Human beings are the core ingredients of an innovation system. And then you have, for example, all the financial sort of ecosystem, how easy it is to get money, how easy is it to, in fact, access both public and private markets, and the whole sort of richness of the innovation and the financial innovation system is very, very critical. And of course, then you have other important elements in terms of the general infrastructure. The infrastructure, which is If you don't have roads, you don't have ports, you don't have basic digital infrastructure, you cannot do much really of value in a society that actually wants to be innovative. So you put all these things together, and those are really the key enablers of innovation. Of course, there are many, fundamental variables which are also very critical. And one of them is, for example, R&D. How much do companies invest in R&D? Companies are there, but if they don't actually invest in R&D, you will not really be getting the benefits of innovation in the economy too much.
Yeah, Doctor, you mentioned just now about leadership, and I'm just putting back to how it is in emerging markets. Have you seen any particular patterns that relate to how good leadership is, especially when it comes to the different forms of governance in emerging markets, where you have the country that's a bit more authoritarian than others? Some others are more democratic, some others practice Westminster style, different forms of governance, really. So what would be the successful picture of patterns that you have observed so far of a good leadership in innovation for governments?
It's varies. There's no one pattern. As in some sense, you have yourself identified. Emerging markets have a range of different kinds of governments, ranging of autocracies and all the way into democracies. But the good examples of economies that have made such transitions in the basis of innovation in the recent decades. If you take example like in Asia, Singapore. Singapore, was a poor country, 50 years ago. And over 50 years, it has really built out its whole innovation ecosystem by a lot of smart strategies, good execution of the smart strategies. And today is one of the most innovative and at the same time most successful and most rich economies in the world. You can look at other examples in Asia, like, China is another example. It's a huge economy, but China was again a very poor country. And today a lot of the success of China is being driven not on the basis of simple manufacturing was probably the case in 30 years ago. Today it's really China the leading edge of many technologies. For example, all the green technology, China is the leader in the world in many green technologies and so on. Even if you look at countries in Europe, take countries like Finland. Finland, people don't realize it, but in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy of Finland also collapsed along the Soviet Union. And it really used innovation and digital technology to come back up. And today, of course, Finland is one of the most prosperous nations and is extremely innovative. The same story for Estonia. Estonia has done wonderful things. So even in developed economies, the economies that are further behind, they can catch up with innovation. And of course, in emerging markets, is a critical thing for emerging markets to be able to keep up, to catch up, and to be able to, create value in the process.
Yeah. And just pulling on that thread a little bit, Professor. So, we talked about national leadership, right? So when I basically talk to politicians, all politicians will tell you that, we're so pro-innovation. We really want to do digital. We really want to do this, really want to do that. However, the execution versus the lip service kind of differs. There's a huge chasm between the two, right? So when you say like a national leadership is sort of required from the top down, let's say, do you mean politicians need to put this on the agenda and do certain things as well, or just make it part of the what is it that differs between the execution of that national leadership versus just saying that we're very pro innovation and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, it's a good question you raise, Wahid, because if you look at, for example, come back to the chain for analogy that I used earlier.
Yeah.
In a typical government, the various ministries are like the various links in the chain. You have Ministry for Education, Ministry for Health, Ministry for, whatever different, or finance and so on. And if you really want the innovation ecosystem to work properly, all these ministries have to be working together in some kind of coordination. You cannot say, okay, well, innovation now is the job of the Minister of Education. You cannot say that. Or it's the job of the Minister of Finance. You cannot say that. So the only way you can actually get that kind of coordination happening across all the different elements is through a higher level sort of guidance or power. And that higher level guidance and power really is the Prime Minister, President, whoever the ruler of the country is. So you need that kind of cross-ministry collaboration to be able to actually get innovation to be executed successfully in a country. And the reality is that that does not always happen. And of course, even if there's a desire to do so, it's actually very hard to make it happen. Even with desire, it's very hard to actually get the kind of cross-ministry collaboration happen effectively in the country. So that's the reason why I usually find that, yes, people talk a lot about innovation, but not everyone is able to achieve it successfully. And that's the reason why the countries that are able to achieve it most successfully are able to also keep on progressing faster and develop a larger and larger lead as compared to the others.
Yes, Doctor, you mentioned just now about the need to invest. And of course, when we talk about investments, an important part of it is the R&D investments from government. And we have seen from the experience of the Pentagon, for example, the investments into the industrial military complex has led to innovation and technology, very directly or indirectly speaking. So have you seen similar instances, especially in the context of non-Western countries besides China, where the government's incentive is key to some of the amazing tools or products that we have seen today?
No, the government plays a very key role in driving innovation in the country. And contrary to what people might believe, as you say yourself, the government does play a very important role, even in the USA, which some people can consider one of the most advanced economies of innovation today. So the government role is critical in supporting innovation, enabling innovation in multiple ways. And you see that in almost every example. I don't think it's a question of China. I think it's a question of almost every economy. Yes, some countries do it better. Some countries do more of something as opposed to the other. Now, for example, you see that this kind of a more active government support is setting industrial innovation policies is becoming fashionable and acceptable in the West too. A lot of people in the US criticize Japan, criticize China for doing these kinds of more top-down, policies. And today what they realize is actually you need some of that. Otherwise, you can't get the kind of progress that you need to make in the key areas. So I would say the government's role, of course, the private sector is very important too. I'm not, it's like all the chinks in the chains links, and all the links in the chain have to be working properly. And the government is a very important chain, both the individual link and at the same time the architect of the entire link that actually happened in the country too. So the government role is critical, and I do think that it's very rare. I can't think of any example of a really truly innovative country where the government doesn't play an important role.
Yeah, 100%. That's really interesting. And the move from, let's say, more laissez-faire, free market, Adam Smithian kind of economics to a bit more industrial policy is very interesting. And you can see with the sort of Trump trade wars and executive orders and stuff, right, that they're pretty much trying to drive some of that kind of industrial policy, right? Like reducing the trade deficits and so on and so forth, right? Which they really didn't care about. I would say like throughout the 90s and 2000s, most of like a lot of China got rich because of the US as well, right? Because a lot of US businesses were just manufacturing from China. But I think they actively want to sort of reverse that trend and bring back local manufacturing in the US, right? Which might not be exactly laissez-faire, but it just requires a harder government intervention, right, to do that. So it's very interesting to the lay person like myself, just seeing that trend. And that's super, super interesting.
Yeah, but I think, you have to make a distinction that China's success was happened because there was transfer of knowledge at the start from America, the Western companies to China as part of manufacturing facilities that were set up out there. But similar kind of things have happened in other economies too. Let's say in India, Bangladesh, other economies also have had outfits set up out there. Now maybe not to the same degree as China, but Chinese government decided more than 20 years ago that innovation was to be a key driver of the national strategy. Okay. So more than 20 years ago, they decided that China has to be one of the top 20 economies in the world in innovation by 2020. And actually China, has exceeded that and has received, and become already in the top 10, 11, 12 by the Global Innovation Index, already several years before that. So what I just want to say is that China focused on innovation as a national strategy. China, as a result, also built out the building blocks, education, improving its universities. Today, we all, talk about Tsinghua and Peking University as being some of the best in the world. But let's keep in mind, 30 years ago, they were not the best in the world. Okay. And they actually had a deliberate strategy of attracting talent back, investing in R&D, investing in opening up more universities. And there was a span of about 10 years in the early 2000s when China literally doubled the number of graduates. So by not double, probably a factor of 3 or 4 in the entire country. So there was a strategy of investing in infrastructure, investing in, human capital, a strategy of building up what I would say is the innovation absorption capacity. So today, what China had is, and it has done very capably, is it has the capacity to absorb innovation and then move further ahead from there. And that is the capacity which not everyone has. It's like I teach you something. Do you actually fully absorb it? And can you actually use that knowledge, whatever I've taught you, to go and make it even better? To make it even better, you need high skills. You cannot just make it better with lower skills. And I think that kind of absorption capacity is what lies at the heart of Chinese success. Is able to take technology, let's say, for example, solar technology, or for example, high-speed trains, learn it, and then improve upon it. And that's where I think the interesting question comes, And it's true that some people might say, well, China has copied some things. But guess what? In innovation, people copy each other all the while. That is something.
If it works, yeah.
It works. It's normal.
Yeah.
It's like our research shows in Global Innovation Index that if you look at just the, let's say the, 2 elements, how much licenses you pay to another person or country for what knowledge you use. So let's say you use a patent or someone else, you've got to pay a license fee for that patent. And how much license fee do you get, royalties do you get for other people using your knowledge, and how much you actually get as a result of that. So how much do you pay others for their knowledge? How much do other people pay you for your knowledge that they use? What we find is that the most innovative countries have high levels of both. They pay high royalties and they also get high license fees. It's not that innovation happens in isolation, only one way, the flow is one way. So what it means basically is that, acquiring new knowledge from others around you is an essential part of driving innovation. And China has done that very well. It's actually acquired knowledge, created knowledge, and which in fact is also shared with other people across the world. So I think this cycle is something which is very critical. And I agree with you that the US has today realized that maybe letting the market decide everything doesn't always yield in the right results, especially given technology changing so fast. And I would say, President Biden already in his IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, he already had created a direction of industrial policy of investing in a few key areas. But this notion of investing in a few key areas has been there even before. If you look at President Obama, he had this whole notion of brain project and trying to actually understand how the human brain actually operates, or the human genome project, in the US, where it was trying to decode the whole human genome. So what I'm just trying to say is that there has to be some direction, which is very useful. There has to be the capacity to be able to learn the best knowledge that is there and to be able to improve beyond that. And I think this is something you see even today, with the whole DeepSeek, the sort of news in China, is that not many countries have the capacity to learn the latest LLM technologies,
right? Yeah,
absorb it and to improve it further. See, that's what China did. Of course, it learned, copied it to some degree, and most important, learned and improved it even beyond that. And now, in effect, what probably has going to happen is that many Silicon Valley companies are going to copy what DeepSeek has done. You see? So, there are all kinds of mutual learning that happens. And even today, you see, for example, the whole Tencent architecture is much more advanced in many ways than the WhatsApp architecture of Facebook. And in social media, TikTok, what TikTok does and this whole AI algorithms are supposed to be the most advanced in this whole social media scene. So you have social media giants in the West learning, copying, and improving from what some of the leaders do, in other big space, which is TikTok and Tencent and so on. So what I'm saying is, there's nothing right or wrong about this. This is how the industry moves. You learn from each other and you keep improving from there. But if you don't have that basic intellectual bandwidth, that basic intellectual strength, you'll be able to improve, actually learn something well enough to be able to improve upon it. You need knowledge. You need actual capacity to develop knowledge. And that is something which is not easy to do.
Doctor, I'm attracted by the example on China. And you mentioned several factors just now: talent attraction, leadership, capital, and also imitating until you perfect the art. But that's China on its own. And I've realized that the Middle Eastern countries are beginning to do that as well. With the capital that they have from oil and gas, they're beginning to attract talents from around the world, attracting some of the best companies to establish their bases there. But do you foresee that that approach would enable them to leapfrog some other countries that have perceivably been more innovative than them for the past 10 years? And perhaps could the Middle East be the next frontier of innovation, or would there still be challenges that they'll have to resolve, considering the maybe structural gap, particularly in education that you mentioned just now, which China has been very successful in?
So, Middle East, at least some countries in the Middle East, not all, have done very well. Okay, there's no question about that. And in many ways, especially the UAE, is like at the frontiers of many areas of innovation, especially service sector innovation. If you look at the whole tourism sector, you look at the whole logistics sector, I think, UAE is at the forefront and the leader in that sector. Will the UAE or the Middle Eastern countries be able to innovate at the frontiers of high-tech, innovation? Certainly, yes, in some limited areas. Let's say, for example, sustainability. This is a market where there's a need for more sustainable energy sources. There's a need for more, there's a high access to solar energies and so on. I think you'll find, because of need and the market conditions, maybe some ability to innovate in some key areas. Some other areas you may have to have a determined government push. Let's say, for example, in AI, UAE, one of the first nations to have a minister for AI. And countries didn't have a minister for AI before. Many people thought it was crazy, but now it's seen that as the right decision. They have a whole university for AI that is in the UAE, in Dubai, I think so. And it's made effort to attract talent in AI to the country. You have similar things, in Abu Dhabi, I think, with the G42 thing, and so on. And there's a whole set of efforts being made. But I believe that a critical issue out here will be human talent. And except for Saudi Arabia, the population base in the core Middle East, GCC countries, of course, it's different if you go to Egypt and other countries, is still very small. And still, there's a need to actually invest very heavily in core human capital in these countries. I think especially Dubai and UAE have made it easier for attracting immigrants. And of course, the quality of life is so high and it's very safe, secure, and everything is so pleasant. People are attracted to it and people are coming in large numbers, and that certainly will help. But you need to have the same kind of a cultural ease to attract expat talent. Singapore did it very successfully, so in many ways, Singapore did that very successfully. Singapore has attracted many talent, but Singapore again has more local Singaporeans than probably what UAE has in terms of local population. Saudi Arabia has the biggest population in the GCC, but then, Saudi is trying to catch up now, it's behind, it's trying to catch up. And it has to build out its whole infrastructure further. You have, for example, in Saudi Arabia, you have KAUST. KAUST has done very well, the university, in attracting great professors from abroad. But I think there needs to be more examples of highly innovative, R&D intensive university in the Middle East. That's something which can be done, but requires strategic effort, strategic leadership, and dedication and money. So if you have that people component out there, then potentially you have the ability to create this kind of leading edge technologies. So can the Middle East lead in some areas? The answer is definitely yes. I think the Middle East will have to make choices because of, you can't do everything being small countries, relatively small countries, even if you're rich. And so I think, it's already shown it can achieve excellence in things like tourism and in logistics and so on, service sector, hospitality, and it's really the best in the world. In high tech, I think there are good attempts being made in some high tech areas, and they will require more dedication and more input. So I think it's feasible. And I think with the right leadership, it can happen, definitely.
Yeah. And it's very interesting when you mentioned about human capital, right, and attracting talent. So I was seeing some statistics the other day that the USA, 50% of unicorn founders, so that's like billion-dollar startups, are basically immigrants, in the US. 50% of Fortune 500 execs basically are also like somehow immigrants, or children of immigrants. So this ability to attract talent is just so key, basically, for any country to kind of leapfrog ahead, right? It's just interesting. Yeah,
I agree with you, Wahid, because if you look at global talent, despite the current restriction on immigration in many countries, is very mobile. And global talent wants to go to a place which is safe, secure, quality of life is high, children are safe, like good schools, the wives or partners have good, possibilities of a good life or a good careers themselves. And what I believe is that there are very few countries in the world which have a combination of not just an economic competitive advantage, but also a cultural competitive advantage. What I mean by cultural competitive advantage is that you can take different cultures. You can take a Brazilian, a South African, an Indian, a Norwegian, and make them feel at home. And making people feel at home is not easy to do. It's actually very, very hard to do. Today, if you look at even, developed economies like Japan, it's very difficult. Japan is super rich, super developed, but it's not a country that has a cultural, ease of living. Let's put it this way. Singapore has it. China doesn't have it also. China is not easy to actually go and live, even non-Chinese out there. Similarly, India doesn't have it. US has it. Many parts of Europe don't have it. Europe is nice to visit. It's nice to go and visit France and Italy. But actually, if you're a non-European origin person, how easy is it for you to live and comfortably integrate? It's not exactly the easiest place, many parts of Europe. UK does have a cultural advantage, in terms of that integration and ease of use. So I think, you can literally count on, two hands the number of countries which have the cultural competitive advantage. And that's what is important, because if you don't have that, you'll not be able to attract talent.
100%. And I think this is something, like you said, national leadership should recognize as well. And I think MBS in Saudi Arabia basically sort of realized this, that, it was much culturally very different Saudi pre-MBS versus post-MBS, right? It's opened up culturally, right? And I feel like also, like, as humanity progresses, we're in 21st century now, the internet is the great equalizer in many ways, not only in terms of culture, but also opportunities as well, right? So previously, like, it's to me, it's very, very interesting. Like, when I visit a very small town in Europe or a small town in, say, Asia, I see folks there, the middle income, lower middle income folks, watching the same Netflix shows as a person would sitting in LA or London, So to me, it's quite interesting how it's a great opportunity, the internet, to kind of align cultures and thinking a certain way that enables different people to do trade together and, learn from each other, like you said, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And but let's not forget, these great internet shows are being done by whom? They're watching Netflix. Netflix is an American corporation, even though, Netflix has different languages and different shows, but there's a predominant bias in terms of what is being shown.
100%, yeah.
Shown is American culture. Not all of it, but a large part of it. So what I'm just trying to say is that this is all, again, part of the soft power of the nation.
Right, yeah.
So yes, there is a globalization that's happening in many respects, but that globalization also has facets to it.
Yeah.
And movies and shows are one part of it, which is very important. I think these things are very critical right now in the global world. I come from India originally, and Indian movies are super popular,
Yeah.
and Indian movies are a very good way of, spreading the cultural appeal of the country. So if you look at, for example, what India is known for today from a cultural point of view, movies, yoga, all these are, the programmers, all these are part of the brand appeal of the country, even though, it still remains quite a poor country in many ways.
Yeah, 100%. I quickly wanted to ask, Professor, so you obviously worked on every year the Global Innovation Index. So I was looking at the last one that you released, and I think the top two countries there was Switzerland and Sweden. So I was quite keen to understand from you, when we think about innovation, we think of the most innovative countries are probably like the US, or probably, some of the G4 countries or G6. We don't really think about Switzerland or Sweden per se as the most innovative places. They're very stable places in terms of perception, but not the most innovative, at least according to perception. So I was wondering, what are the factors that you think makes them rank so highly, basically?
Well, first of all, the US is ranked very high. You mentioned the top two, but the next one is US.
Yeah, right.
So US is ranked very high, and I think what the US achieves, given its size and scale, is huge. For a large country, actually, it does amazingly well. But let's not forget, Switzerland is actually an extremely innovative country. It has one of the highest concentration R&D labs in the world. It has some of the most innovative large companies in the world, like, for example, Nestle. It has some of the most stable and deep financial systems in the world, even though I know the Swiss banking system has its own crisis right now. So I think, it's a country where operationally things move. The trains are 98% on time. The infrastructure is superb. Education is superb. Stable economy for centuries. And it's got various elements which actually make it a very attractive place for talent to move to in countries to invest in R&D. The universities, for example, EP is a small economy, with a smaller economy than the US. But if you look at schools like ETH and EPFL, they are right at the level of MIT and so on. They're as sophisticated technically as the best in the world. So you have some of the best universities, some of the great talent, stable markets, very good infrastructure, and a lot of great ingredients for creating, innovative economies. So I think that the reason why Switzerland sort of, all the links are strong, and getting a university strong is not easy. If you take, for example, the US, why does it come number 3 and not number 1? Is because some of the links are not as strong, you see. The US has MIT and Stanford and Cornell, but guess what? Education level on the whole in the US is not that great. Okay, the average level in the US is not the level of MIT and Stanford.
Yeah, it's very unequal society, yeah.
Unequal society. You look at infrastructure.
Yeah.
Go to the roads in New York City. The drive from JFK to the city is like, full of potholes. So what I'm just trying to say is that the US has those spikes of excellence, and still has tremendous strengths, which actually make it a very strong economy. But it has, it's got weak links. It's got some weaker links. The infrastructure is not that green. Look at this huge amounts of power outages that happen in the US is because the whole electrical grid is not as advanced. So, there are lots of issues that are not fully not fully as strong in the US. And that's one reason why it comes a little bit lower. But yes, of course, in the popular mind, we all think of, Google and, Meta and all the top companies from the US. But, it's a whole national level assessment. And so I think US is doing very well. No question about it. But, what one benefit of looking at this ranking is sometimes you see countries that you do not expect be in that level. So it's like the question you made about Switzerland. So, Switzerland, why is Switzerland coming up number one so many years? If that is true to some degree, then it's a good reason for you to actually go and figure out what is Switzerland doing so right that is helping it to be at that level. Similarly, in Africa, you see some countries doing better than others. Or in Asia, some countries doing better than others. So the question, you can actually go and identify which countries and then try to ask the question, why are they doing better than others? And that gives you interesting lessons and to learn from.
Yeah, Doctor, I would just like to ask on the GII. I've sat in government meetings, one in East Africa, one in Southeast Asia, where they literally discuss how do we go up the ranks in the GII. So I feel that sometimes the perception from government leaders would be a bit misguided because they think that the way for you to improve is to have improvement in ranking, which is not necessarily so because, as you mentioned just now, you'll have to look into the weak links and improve instead of just having spikes of improvement for you to catch up to the others. What would be your advice for some of these leaders thinking that they need to look into the metrics and try to get up the ladder instead of looking at it comprehensively so that they can improve on the weak links, but not just catching up to the rankings of others?
So, Musal, I'm very pleased to hear you say that these GII is discussed in various government discussions, and it is true because in latest research by the WIPO, they found that the GII are used in at least 100 countries in the world in various innovation discussions. It's very, very widely used, and I'm very pleased about that. I do believe, by the way, that it is important to look at the rankings because the rankings do tell you a story. There it's an assessment telling you how you're faring on the different rankings, different elements, and you may disagree or argue with some other rankings, but rankings do give you a message. It's the same thing like, in a business school. We get ranked all the while, business school. And some people say, rankings, why worry about them? There are too many of them and they all sort of maybe don't motivate the right actions. I do believe that every ranking tells you a story. And that story is one which is for you to digest, reflect, and maybe accept or maybe, adapt for your own needs. But I do think rankings are very important because they provide them clarity. They provide them transparency. Not to forget that competitive element, so you're competing with some other countries or some other schools. So I do think it's good to look at rankings. What I also to recommend to governments is that they use the GII framework to create for their own national economies a more customized innovation model. So India, for example, done that. They have an India innovation model that is based on the GII model. And this, I think, is very useful because in the Global Innovation Index is a more generic model where the basic buckets or the basic framework is correct, but the actual variables measuring the framework are more generic that are available for 130 countries. But, every country's context is different. Every country's national priorities are different. So what we tell people is keep the framework the same, adopt the framework of the GI, which is correct and time-tested, but populate the framework components with variables that are linked to your own strategic projects. Because in your country, you might have this project A, which is very critical. So let's actually measure that as part of this framework. And you can create a more customized version of the framework. So in India, for example, they have created the India Innovation Index, which is based on the Global Innovation Index. And then what is even nice is that they've gone actually, assess the innovation capacity of the different states. And the states, now they have a clear benchmark of how they're doing. And the states use it to improve, to compete. Let's say, for example, a federal structure, some states, they want to attract a foreign investment in their state. So they actually have data to show, well, look, we are doing better than your other state you're considering for investments. It's actually a good tool for them to get investments in the state, or to look at weaknesses and say, well, we actually have this weakness to correct into the system. So I do think that getting these benchmarks, even if the benchmarks are incomplete and not perfect, is actually a very useful, healthy exercise to engage in.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in KPIs. I really love that example of the Indian states actually doing that. This is really interesting. I had the former Prime Minister of Estonia on the podcast recently, and he was talking about how Estonians are absolutely obsessed with KPIs, all sorts of KPIs, all civil servants in Estonia are just like obsessed with these rankings, right? So 100% like it can be sometimes vanity metrics, but at the same time, if you need a basically like a North Star, right, to chase after and see the improvements. And I love what you said, Professor, about connecting it to your local kind of projects and mandates as well, right? And I think that's where the key is basically. How can I push this button in order to push the bigger button, basically, right? And that's really interesting. I quickly want to ask you, Professor, and let me just quickly see if I can share my screen. So I want to ask you about the relationship between innovation and actual quality of life in a country. We talked about the US, for instance, right? And some of the G8 countries. So there is so for the listeners who are listening and not seeing this, so this is a graph of how over the 20th century, the price of goods that have gone up versus the price of goods that have gone down. And this is more like a US study between 2000s to 2022. So for me, what was interesting is here, like all the top three things that affect the quality of life, which is your healthcare, your education, and housing and food, basically, four things have all gone up in price, So, and what have gone down in price is basically like computer software, as we know, television and clothing and new cars, and for instance. But the top three things that really affect the quality of life for a country, which is like, healthcare, education, and food and housing, have basically gone up, right? So how do you sort of explain innovation helping or hurting the quality of life, basically? Because for me, if I'm innovating, I expect the quality of life to be better, right? And it should be more accessible to everybody. There's this notion that in the 60s in the West, even if you're a factory worker, you come back home to a big home, right? With 5 kids and a single parent income and single family income, you can sustain that, right? Whereas now you see this inflationary pressures all around, even the big cities, around Southeast Asia and so on and so forth as well, where if 2 people are working like white collar jobs and still, they can only afford to live in an apartment, right? So how do you kind of fix that issue of innovation helping improve the quality of life, really, right, as a policymaker?
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting sort of question you're raising, and also the data you showed is shown for the US.
Yeah.
Again, innovation is about bringing new products and services to the market. And then there's the interesting question of how much does the market pay for it? And how do you regulate how much is the market paying for it? So if you do the same graphs for Europe, for example, it will look very different. In Europe, for example, the proportion of spending on healthcare is much lower. Why is it much lower? Because in Europe, there's much more collective bargaining. The single-payer systems in Europe for healthcare as opposed to multi-payer systems in the US. So the governments are the single buyer of medical services, and they negotiate, price agreements with the pharma companies about keeping the prices low. They also have other conditions in how the healthcare system is managed, in which keeps the entire system price lower. For example, the price of litigation is much lower. The insurance risk for medical practice or malpractice is much lower in Europe. So one can argue that, actually the quality of healthcare in Europe is better on average than the quality of healthcare in the US, and actually less expensive than the US. You can make the same argument education. Education too, the average education in Europe, actually one can argue, is better than the average education in the US. And the cost is lower. Why? Because the cost is mandated and controlled by the government. In many cases, it's completely free for citizens. So I think, one has to keep in mind also the fact that the way the country and the country's government regulates innovation and the access to innovative products and services by the market also is important. That's the reason why government's role is critical. And just to give you a sense in terms of, let's say, healthcare, because you said healthcare is the most expensive part in the US. I saw a study once that showed that in healthcare, the two parts of the healthcare debate. One is preventive and other is actual, in the hospital, actual care in the hospital. If you actually so what is huge in the US is the actual cost of hospital care. If you look at the total amount of money spent in US on the preventive side and the actual hospital care side, and you compare the total amount of money spent in Europe on the preventive side and on the hospital care side, the total volumes actually are quite similar. Okay. So in total aggregation, Europe spends roughly the same amount of the US. The difference is in the US, 80% of the expenditure spent on hospitals and 20% on preventive. In Europe, it's much more balanced. Okay, I forget the exact percentage, much more balanced. Much higher proportion spent on preventive and proportion less on hospital care. So what you see is it's the outcome of health outcomes in Europe are better than health outcomes in the US. So in terms of quality of life, the way the society or the economy allocates resources, in this case of healthcare preventive versus, actual patient care in a hospital, can actually affect the outcomes, quality of outcomes. So, that doesn't mean healthcare in Europe is less innovative than healthcare in America. But there's a whole sort of context of how the whole system comes together. Systemic change, basically, what it means. So today, for many cases, you have to look at systemic change across multiple variables, multiple actors, multiple factors in the economy. And healthcare, food security, almost everything today is systemic change. So that's one reason why I still argue governments have a very important role, because private sector cannot look at the systemic change and will not argue for the whole system. A private sector player almost always will argue for its own position in the chain. And even if it actually controls a large part of the chain, let's say in the case of some social media companies, it'll argue for maximizing profit for its own gains. So it's very, very important that government ministers, government leaders, actually understand this complexity of the innovation debate and don't get just swayed by one model versus the other. And in many ways, yes, you can learn something a lot from the way the US education system operates, MIT operates, or Cornell operates, but you can't learn from everything. A lot of the parts of the US system, enrollment rates in university after high school is decreasing. People don't feel like actually it's enough value to get an education from university. So, these are important questions that actually affects the economy as a whole.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, really. And that systems approach is very, very important, right? We're almost coming to the end of the podcast. So we have actually one last question from one of our listeners. Correct me if I get the name wrong, but it's Laszlo. Laszlo asked, what if innovation was about collaboration rather than competition? Curious to know the professor's view on how this perspective might reshape strategies.
No, innovation is fundamentally about collaboration. It is more collaboration than competition. And I gave the example earlier of how the most innovative nations also, get the highest royalties and also pay the highest license fees. So that basically defines collaboration. You acquire knowledge of someone else and you share knowledge with someone else. That's how knowledge moves forward faster. So, the competition part is more an economic question of, essentially how that innovation is played out in the marketplace. But the basic idea of, research, for example, is all about collaboration. You share ideas and you move forward faster. One thing that concerns me, especially these days, is that given the increasing separation of the STEM ecosystems in China and the US, the two biggest innovation economies in the world, if the flow of ideas across the two economies decreases, will that actually affect the overall rate of innovation? Let's say, for example, if DeepSeek did not share all its procedures in open source method, how long would it take companies in the US to learn about that properly? And vice versa. So what I'm just trying to say is that if you just create delays in sharing knowledge and sharing information, create more barriers, I don't think it's good for society as a whole. And whether, DeepSeek doesn't necessarily affect people's lives right now, but almost there's so many domains, where there's agriculture, where there is, food, where there is, health, where it actually impacts people's lives materially. So I do believe that globally, I hope that, the drive towards collaboration doesn't decrease substantially, because the reality is that the collaboration in the frontier of science and technology really happens across a few nations. I would literally name less than 10 nations, that drive the frontiers. And so it's very important that these 10 nations collaborate and try to use technologies to improve the state of the world and to basically, fight against the danger of climate change and all that. Because if not, it's not going to happen,
Yeah, 100%. That's why I'm a big proponent of open source, especially when it comes to AI versus, the closed source approach. I do think that just in terms of AI and the base models of LLM models, there's still an open question of whether open source is better or, closed source, the closed AI approach, or open AI, which is actually a closed company, right? But yeah, that's very interesting, Professor. I have one last question to end with. So obviously, like emerging market leaders, say I'm an emerging market leader, I'm a policy person or a civil servant or a politician in emerging market. I've got like tons of other priorities in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of like providing the basic necessities of the state to my people, right? What advice would you give emerging market leaders if they want to jumpstart innovation in their country, basically, given all the other constraints and priorities that they have today,
Yeah. I think, the advice I would give is they should try to make sure that they provide the best possible education for their own people. If possible, attract some talent from outside, to whatever degree that is feasible, not feasible for everyone, but if it's feasible. And really try to make life simple for entrepreneurs. I think following the motto, as Singapore did, make life simple for business is very useful. And then, you'll have innovation happening. Because see, not all innovation needs to be a frontiers of technology, DeepSeek innovation. Okay, because fundamentally the two types of innovation that happen. One is, the deep tech frontier technologies where you discover LLMs and it creates a whole new range of applications. The other kind of innovations are more market-led innovations where basically a market has demand and you basically put together existing technologies and create that kind of a supply for that demand. It's like, for example, what happened in Africa with the whole M-Pesa, payment system. M-Pesa was really an aggregation of, existing technologies. It wasn't fundamental rediscovery of, anything new, anything fundamental, technically new. It was putting together current technology to satisfy a market demand. So I think both innovations are very important. You need to actually have that demand of the market satisfied, and at the same time, you need to create new technologies. Of course, the ones who create new technologies are the ones who get greater value. Okay, that's one reason why people try to move towards that. But I think we need to keep on doing both. And countries certainly that are less sophisticated from a STEM perspective should focus more on the market-driven innovations. Let the good people in the country create innovations for the local markets or regional markets using existing technologies. Nothing wrong with that. You can actually, add value and create interesting things. And I think that's where governments should just make life easy. Put the infrastructure in for education, put the infrastructure in for, highways and roads and all that kind of stuff, and let people do what they have to do. Now, if you really have ambition beyond that of saying, okay, look, we really want to be at the frontiers of, deep tech and space tech and all that, then you need massive R&D. You need to have massive R&D either done by the government or incentivize the private sector to do it. The private sector can also do it if you have large companies, if you give them the right incentives to do it. So you have to find some combination of public spending, private spending, and R&D to actually make it happen. But the deep tech frontier technology innovation does not come cheap. It has to require deep pockets and deep investments and continued investments over time. So, that's what I would say. You have to make your choice about what kind of innovations you want to support. And just keep in mind that if it's deep tech, you better have deep pockets and and deep ambitions out there.
Yeah, 100%. Very sound advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Professor Soumitra, for your time today. With that, we'll wrap up and hope to see you soon again on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your valuable time with us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Doctor.